All right, so we're going to have a questions and answer session after Orion for both of them. So think of the questions you want to ask Roger. Now we're going to have the story of Heroku. Orion created a company that is one of the most famous alums from Y Combinator, the accelerator in Silicon Valley that has created Airbnb and Dropbox and many other really successful companies in the Valley. So Orion is going to talk about how he went from having an idea to selling a company to Salesforce for $250 million in less than 4 years, 3.5 years. He was able to go from idea to acquisition. So let's welcome Orion to the stage.
Hey there. So I'm going to tell you the story of Heroku, how we went about ideating it, creating it, growing it, and eventually selling it. I'm going to spend most of my time at the beginning of the story, which is sort of how we came to form the company and why, and how we got started. There's 3 years of stories, but most of this will probably be the first 12 months. In any case, I started off, with a regular day job for about 1.5 years after I got out of college, and I discovered very quickly I didn't know anything about startups. I didn't know anything about entrepreneurship. My dad had the same job for his entire adult life, and I figured I was going to do the same thing. The idea of working at multiple companies seemed strange. The idea of starting your own company was completely off my radar. But I discovered really quickly that I hated having a boss. I'm just a really bad minion. And it really bothered me that people were making 50 times as much as I was at the company, and I felt like I was twice as smart as they were, and it was driving me up the wall. So after about 1.5 years, I got frustrated with the company I was working at, and I decided to quit and start my own thing. And I started my first company with my Heroku co-founder Adam Wiggins. I didn't meet James until a few years later. And we worked for 1 year and made $0. And we were just terrible at the startup thing, but we didn't know any better. It was just so much fun. We'd get up every morning and just code, work on this product. And like 1 year into it, we got like our first check that we paid off all of our bills, paid the rent, paid for the servers, and there was like $900 left over. And the 3 co-founders split that up. We had $300 each. It was about my rent at the time. And I'm like, yes, you mean I can get paid to do this? This is amazing. I just felt like I had tricked the system, that I could do something that was just fun for me and actually be able to pay my bills, and I thought it was fantastic. And we got better over time, and fast forward 8 years, we had been through, we were on our 5th company at that point. Some of them had been miserable failures, some of them had been marginally successful, but the whole time had been just epic fun. We were running a consulting company in Los Angeles. The consulting company was an attempt to pay the bills while we worked on more interesting things, but it ended up being a really interesting place to learn. And this is where, in my talk yesterday, I talked about experiential pain and how that's a wonderful source of ideas. We experienced a lot of experiential pain in our consulting company that led to the ideas that were in Heroku, which is why it's important to talk about it. At that point, basically, we would go into small and medium-sized businesses, and they would say, oh my God, we're running this entire business on an Excel spreadsheet. And we're doing $30 million of business a year, and Bob's nephew made an Excel spreadsheet to run the whole business, and somebody hit backspace on a macro and deleted it, and now the whole business is broken, we don't know what to do, dear God help us. And we'd come in and build them something with a lamp stack to codify their business, and they'd love us, and they'd write us this ridiculously big check for a small business, like $100,000 or something, and it'd be a screaming deal for them compared to what it would cost off the shelf for SAP or something, but I felt bad. Like, I felt the pain of my customers because it seemed ridiculous that something as simple as setting up these simple pieces of software was costing so much money that it was almost crushing these businesses, and we kept thinking, my God, there's got to be a better way. This is miserable that all these small businesses are held back because most of them can't afford to get the custom software that they need. And the other thing I talked about in my talk yesterday was about how it's important to take time, even though you're focused on your startup, even though you're focused on your career, to keep educating yourself and keep abreast of business and philosophy and economics and things like that. And there was an important book that Adam Wiggins came across to that point that he shared with James and I called Small Matter of Programming. And this book was really pivotal for the idea of Heroku. It was a very small run book, only probably 10,000 copies sold, written by an academic. But it was this idea of examining the process of programming, the process of coding, and saying it's a very natural thing. It isn't this weird thing that is the domain of domain of a very small sect. It's something that we all do, and the author described programming in everyday life. And one of the examples that I remember was crochet patterns, where your grandma is basically knows how to code because she can write crochet patterns and she can recrochet patterns and she can make really cool knit socks. And this is just a form of programming that is more accessible. And there's sort of this debate we were having internally, which is like, there's two methods to doing software development. You have, on one hand, real tools, real programming languages, quote unquote, where you're writing code with Java and C and Python and Ruby and all these things. And then you had sort of this other camp, which was the tools for the non-technical people. It was like Microsoft Access and Excel and FileMaker Pro. And there was this big divide in between the two. You had tools that were very limited but were very accessible, and tools that were very powerful and very flexible but only accessible to a small number of people. And the debate was always, someday everyone's going to know how to program. The subtitle here is Perspectives on End-User Computing, and end-user computing refers to the idea of everyone programming, not just this select, expensive few of consultants that we were at that time. And are the graphical tools going to get better so much that everyone uses them? And in the future, instead of writing things in C or Java or Python or Ruby, am I going to be like, doing Tony Stark stuff of bringing objects together and putting my software together in a visual manner? Or are the natural language, the power of natural language you get in coding, going to get easier and easier over time, such that ordinary people, when they're in high school or in their middle school, are going to learn how to code, and basic software literacy will eventually become something that everyone has access to? And this book convinced us that the visual system will never reach the expressiveness of natural language, but the expressiveness of natural language could eventually become accessible to everyone. And at that same time, we were discovering Ruby. We really liked it. We thought it was a really powerful language. It caused us to give up on PHP at the time. And we went to RailsConf in 2007. And we had a really powerful experience there, where for the first time ever, we went to a technical conference, a software conference, and everyone that we met was not the typical hacker that we had known for years. These were people who, a year or two ago had been a glassblower or an HR manager or a non-technical person, and they'd picked up Ruby, found that it was powerful, they were writing real software in it, and they were doing real things in it. And we're like, whoa, something's happened here. Like, a line has been crossed where a different cohort of people are getting access to software, but everyone was saying the same thing, which is, I don't know how to deploy this. I don't know how to set up a database. What's this Linux thing? Like, how do I get this on the internet? And there's all these other still very complicated technical questions associated with coding that were preventing this group of new non-technical people from getting into the software development. So sort of inspired by this book, this vision of end-user computing, I talked about the BHAG yesterday, the big, hairy, audacious goal that you use as sort of a directional thing with your entrepreneurial compass. Our BHAG was, we want everyone in the world to be able to have access to software. We want everyone in the world to be able to code, even if they're not a technical person. And that's a pretty audacious goal, and it's a goal that has not been met yet, but it gave us direction. So we said, well, maybe if we can solve some of these non-programming problems, if we can solve the whole, how do I set up a database, and how do I set up a server, and what's Linux, and what's security, what's a firewall, how do I do routing and load balancing, if we could solve all those problems and just let someone write their code and be done, we could make the world a better place. So our very first stab at this was to create a website where you clicked on a button and it said, yay, you have a Rails app, and it's live and it's running on the internet. And it was, a skeleton app that was created by the app generator. And there was a in-browser editor where you could navigate through your files, you could look at your code, you could edit the code in real time, you could see your app change. And on the back end, it was provisioning the router, the load balancer, the database, backups, all that other stuff was just done for you. And you didn't have to worry about it. It was one mouse click to get a live running app. And this was pretty cool. And we decided, well, we should do something with this. This is a cool idea. We like this. We've done 5 startups so far. All of them have been marginally successful. And from the business angle, we were getting a little bored of the whole repetitious process that we'd been through before of the startup, where we have no money and we're trying to bootstrap and we can't really hire anyone, and we limp along for a year and a half, and now we're making enough money that we can hire 2 or 3 people. We were wanting to just fast forward to have a team and start pushing a product out the door. So we'd heard legend that up north in the land of San Francisco there was venture capital. And if we traveled there, and we could scoop gold out of the mountain and make a company happen. So we heard about Y Combinator. We read Paul Graham's blog, and we're like, we should get into this. We heard it's really exclusive and really hard to get into. What should we do? So we emailed Paul Graham and said, hey, I hear your office is in Baltimore or is in Boston, and we happen to be at Boston at a wedding right now. Maybe we could just swing by and have coffee with you and talk to you about our idea instead of sending in an application. He's like, yeah, sure, just come on by the coffee shop. So we hopped in an airplane. We flew from San Francisco all the way to Boston. Took a taxi over to his neighborhood, had coffee with him, and showed him our idea, talked about our stuff, and had this fantastic conversation. And then hopped in the plane and started flying back. And we got an email from him at our layover in Chicago saying, hey, I love your idea. You're in. You're in the next Y Combinator. Come and we'll do it. And we're like, yes. So we packed our bags and moved up to San Francisco and started continuing work on our product. At that point, we had been working on this thing for about 2 months when Y Combinator started. It was like November, December, or October, November, 3 months. And we kicked off in January, and at this point we were ready to start showing people. We invited our 10 closest friends to look at it, and we had added a feature where they could, we wanted 30 or 40 people to look at it to get feedback from, and we added a feature where we said, well, you're the only 10 people we know that work on Ruby, so if you know other Rubyists, you can forward them an invite to let them into the system. And they're like, okay, that's nice. And we passed that out, and over the weekend, someone forwarded it to the guy at Ruby Inside, and he did a blog post about us going, hey, check this thing out, it's awesome. And then everyone was on the forums going, someone forward me an invite, someone forward me an invite. We come in on Monday, and we've got 15,000 people on the platform, which we're frantically scaling up at this point to handle that kind of load. But it was pretty exciting, because like out of nowhere, we did not intend to launch, and we had this massive crowd of people, and that was the first indication that we were touching on an actual need, like this feeling that we had that there was this need to push to a new level of platform was validated. And that week we had a knock on our door, and there was a VC from O'Reilly Venture Fund going, hey, I saw the Ruby Inside post, I hunted you guys down, do you guys want like $1 million of venture capital? And we're like, we called Paul Graham, we're like, hey man, this guy's offering us money, what should we do? And he said, well, if you're going to talk to a VC, you should talk to lots of VCs. So the next thing we knew, we were sitting down with 10 different VCs. It was me and Adam and James just disappeared. Like we didn't see him for a year after that. And it was just Adam and I working on the product now. And James spent 3 months courting VCs and talking to them, and it's ridiculous, like the stuff he had to go through of like playing one against the other and getting one to show a term sheet, and then using that term sheet to get another one to get jealous and want to raise his terms. And then it was Paul Graham always described VCs as high school girls, anyways. At the end of this whole process, come demo day, where everyone in Y Combinator demos their product and to a crowd of VCs in the hopes of getting a term sheet or hopes of getting an offer. We had just closed the deal that morning. We had signed a $3 million deal with Redpoint. So we were giving our demo, but we were cool as cucumbers because the deal was already sealed. We had nothing to worry about. And at that point, we needed to start hiring people, and hiring people is hard. But we were lucky, because you remember we had a consulting company in LA. We had left that company behind, and it was 25 people at its peak, but without us tending to it, it had dwindled to 3. And we called those 3 guys up and said, we're dissolving the company, you've got a new job, come up to San Francisco. And they did. So we had our first 3 hires on the very first day, and they were all expert programmers that we had trained and did things exactly the way we liked to, because we had taught them how to do it, and it was fantastic, and we got going. And it was a good stroke of luck, and we started to build the company from there. So we didn't know how to talk about our company at that time, because the thing that we didn't understand was that we were delving into a new market. And there's this whole being early is the same as being wrong concept, and we were dangerously close to being too early to make this happen. If anything, we were a couple of months too early. But maybe if we'd been any earlier, or if it would have been any later, we wouldn't have had enough time to get this off the ground. So we would tell people what our product was. Hey, it's this platform where you can push your code out to it, and you don't have to worry about infrastructure. It just runs, and everything's great. And people would say, okay, so what you're saying is that you're hosting. And we would say, no, we're not hosting. Hosting is what you don't need because you have us. Like, so, and there was no term for it, and this caused us so much friction. And we debated this for a long time and said, well, when the automobile first came out, people didn't know what the heck an automobile was. So they called them, for the longest time, they called them horseless carriages, because everyone knew what a carriage was, and everyone knew a carriage had horses. So as soon as you defined it in the terms of what it gets rid of, then now it suddenly makes sense. So our tagline was hosting is obsolete. We didn't want to be called hosting. We thought that was a dead end because we weren't hosting. We were an alternative to hosting. And that finally communicated the message, and sort of figuring out what to call us was really, really handy. It eventually got the name PaaS. Once there were other entrants into the market, once Google App Engine came out and Microsoft Azure came out, there was Platform as a Service, which is the moniker that it goes by now. But it was very difficult to explain it to people. It was very difficult to pitch back before it had a name. So here was the interesting thing. What we originally made was a learning tool. People were able to go on, click a couple buttons, and they could start making an app, and they could have the app live, and it was really cool. But mostly, it was useful for people who were learning to program. Like there were it wasn't necessarily a tool for serious developers. Now we added a button at some point where if people could hit a button, they could download their code as a zip file and their code in their database, and they thought that was great because they could take it and put it on a real hosting platform, or they could and you could also upload a zip file, and it would replace the code that was there running on our servers. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there was this big group of people who showed up on our platform who they never used the editor, they never touched any of the buttons or any of the cool tools we're building. They just showed up with a zip file that they had made elsewhere, uploaded it, and all of a sudden they're running their business on our platform. And we were like, you guys are doing it wrong. This isn't a place to run your business. This is wait. And there was this moment where we realized that something was happening, that there was a completely different cohort of people. It was a smaller cohort. We had like 25,000 people who were learning to program Rails at that point on our platform, and we had like 500 people who were running their businesses off of it. And these people were very interesting to us. And this was the first hint that we got that of actual PaaS, of this platform as a service instead of this web editor. We thought our web editor was our key competency, the core competency, the thing that made our platform different. And we built on top of that this ability to push your code out with Git. And remember the first time we Git pushed, and the code pushed and it ran, and we saw it for the first time, and we were just like, oh yeah, this is special. And there was kind of this pregnant pause at that point, and it was really cool. And what happened next was interesting, because we now had two sets of customers who had two wildly different needs. One needed this web editor, one needed the ability to go in and twiddle the code and see live updates, and the other group of people needed a performant, stable, production-ready system. And how you build each of those is wildly different. So around that time, Learning Rails, the O'Reilly book came out. And, great, it's another O'Reilly book. But wait, chapter 1, page 1, getting started with online, with Heroku. And we're like, oh, wow. So now all these people are learning Heroku, and the very first thing they see is this book, and it tells them how to get their thing on our platform, which was so cool. And at the same time, we were having this discussion of we should kill the text editor, we should kill all the learning tools because we need to focus on this smaller group of people that are using this for production apps. And it felt like talking about strangling a puppy. It was horrible because all these learning tools are here in the books, and every time we go to a convention, people would swarm to us and go, oh my God, I didn't know how to program, and I found your tool, and it was so great, and I love it, and now I can program, and thank you so much for making this. And now we're talking about getting rid of this, the thing that got us famous, the thing that got us funding, like the thing that got us all this attention. And the biggest mistake that we made as a business was that we spent borderline 6 months arguing about what to do about this instead of doing something about it. What we didn't know about pivots at the time. We didn't have a concept for that. But what we needed to do was to decide which of these markets we wanted to go after. And if it was time to go after the production platform as a service market, which it was, we needed to pivot into it. And we spent 6 months faffing about trying to build two separate products on one code base, having all kinds of problems because we couldn't, with the staff that we had, satisfy both needs at the same time. And finally, we decided to strangle a puppy and split the product up. And we created Heroku Garden, which was the old product, the old learning tool. It's not supported. It has no guarantee of uptime. It's not getting new features. It's just sitting there for people to use. And then when you want to go to a production system, here is our new Heroku production account, where the only way to get your code into it is to do a git push to deploy. And it took us 6 months to figure that out. In that period of time, it took us so long to figure that out, we needed to raise another $2 million to keep the lights on as we pushed forward. We plowed forward from that place. Now, eventually, we waited too long also to start charging people. It took us a long time to figure out how to monetize this. And I would even go so far as to argue that we still haven't figured out properly how to monetize our platform 5 years in. And it's an ongoing struggle, but it's something that I wish we had started thinking about a year earlier, because maybe I'd be a year further along now at this point. But our first thing came out, we were charging fixed amounts for databases of various size. We started charging per dyno hour, dynos being a virtualization container that you can run a process in, such as a thin or a mongrel or a JVM that can handle backend work or web requests. And we finally got off the ground and finally started charging people money, and the platform continued to grow. There's our dyno slider on the right-hand side. We can pick how many dynos you want. It was actually a really fun thing because, normally when you've got a piece of infrastructure, if it's time for you to scale up, unless you've designed things just right, because most people start off with everything jammed onto the same server, and then, oh my God, now they need to scale X, or they need to scale Y, and they're spending all this time making the site crash and editing configuration files. The idea that you can go in and just raise a slider to have more processing power was a really powerful idea. One of our very first production customers was a guy who worked in the same office building as us, and he came rushing over to us one day. He's like, oh my God, there's an article about my company that's going to be in the New York Times in an hour and a half. I need to get my app off of Heroku and onto a real server so that I can handle the load. And we're like, oh no, just raise it to 5 dynos, you'll be fine. And he's like, what? He's like, here, just take the slider and slide it up there to 5 dynos. And he did, and then the traffic came and it handled the spike. And then, now instead of paying like 5 cents an hour for the platform, he's paying, $2.50 or whatever, $1.50 for the platform, and then 4 hours later the traffic had subsided and he slid the slider back down to his original amount. He's like, that was amazing, having the ability to elastically adjust to the platform. It was really, really cool. So the next thing that happened was the NoSQL revolution happened. Suddenly there's Redis and there's Cassandra and there's all these, and there's MongoDB, and everybody has their own pet system that they want to run, and the SQL databases that we were providing weren't enough. And we wanted to build all of these things, and we realized we didn't have the bandwidth. There was no way that we could possibly add all the features to the platform that we wanted to add. And the solution we came up with was, because, hey, infrastructure as a service, other people can run their own services that are within a millisecond of where our servers are, we could have third parties sell services to our customers through a marketplace that we could design that was not possible at any point in the past. One of the companies that came into our store was selling Memcache as a service. Memcache, that's memory. That's like, it's a the idea of being able to sell something, the kinds of things you could sell inside of a 1 millisecond latency window was astonishing. And we created this big marketplace, and suddenly all these companies started coming on and adding network effects to our platform, because you could get whatever weird, obscure service that you wanted, or make a business using us as a channel to run your business, to sell to our customers. And this was a really, really good idea. It allowed us to vastly increase the surface area of what we could offer our customers without us having to build everything ourselves. So eventually, we ran into Salesforce. Eventually, we got to the acquisition. Now, to go back, we received our first acquisition offer 6 months into this whole process. We received an offer for $20 million, and we're like, we haven't even built anything yet. No. Yes, that's a lot of money, and yes, I'm tempted, but I feel like we'd be selling ourselves short, because we have this big vision and we've barely been able to address it. And 6 months, so we said no, and 6 months later we got another acquisition offer for $40 million, and then we got one for $75 million, and then we got one for $125 million, and the numbers kept getting bigger and bigger, and we're like, can't believe that we're saying no to this. But most of the companies that were going to acquire us, we didn't like them. They had a long reputation of just crushing startups after getting a hold of them and tearing the teams apart and throwing the products away, and we had a great deal of love for what we were doing. And then finally, 3 years in, we had hired a new CEO at this point who had a lot of connections to a lot of different companies, and Salesforce, the platform as a service thing had happened. It was starting to turn into a big deal. Google had their offering, Microsoft had their offering, Salesforce had theirs via Force.com, but it was only of interest to people who were already Salesforce customers and wanted to write things in Apex. And then they had another one, which was their VM Force, where there was a partnership with VMware. And that turned out to be a failure. They weren't able to actually get the product off the ground. So suddenly they realized that they didn't have a valid product in this market. They desperately needed to get in. They heard that the only other companies to potentially acquire in this space were Google and Microsoft, and no one's going to acquire Google and Microsoft. So that came down to us. And they came to us, and part of the reason that we said yes to them was that they were a hardcore cloud platform. They really, really believed in software as a service, infrastructure as a service, and not. We were always afraid that someone was going to try to box up Heroku and sell it as a device or as a piece of packaged software. And even though they were not very cool, and even though they were kind of dorky, like they had a lot of values in common with us, and they had a good track record of being good to their acquisition targets. So after much debate and after a very generous offer from them, we eventually said yes and decided to come on and be a part of the Salesforce team. And that was a really fun day. That was a really fun day because at that point we had 35 employees, and I got to sit down and sign the documents with each of these guys, moving them over to Salesforce and with their stock options. And I got to, I had the pleasure of getting to mint a lot of millionaires that day, and that felt really good. These guys are my friends. These guys have been with me for a long time, and it was a good day. We went to Dreamforce, went up on stage, and got introduced by Benioff in front of everybody, and it was a big party. We went back to Y Combinator, and we got the coveted black shirts. You get gray shirts when you join Y Combinator that says, I'm going to make something people want, and then if you actually get an acquisition, you get the I made something people want. And that's the three of us. That's Adam on the left, James in the middle, and me on the right, accepting our shirts at YC. That, of all the crazy things that happened at that point, this is one of the ones that I was most proud of. And at that point, we were the biggest exit that Y Combinator would ever have. We might still be. Dropbox hasn't been acquired. Airbnb hasn't acquired. Those guys are going to blow us out of the water when they eventually do get an IPO or an acquisition. But yeah, it was a really, really good day, and good things came out of there after that. This was one of my favorite moments because Ruby sort of got us there. We're a polyglot platform now. You can deploy any language you want, but our first love was Ruby, and Matt, who is the creator of Ruby, was still working on Ruby in his part-time, from his day job, and Benioff went out to Japan and met with him and offered him a job to be on the Heroku team, where he would still do what he was doing before, but do it as a Heroku employee and continue to push the Ruby language forward. And he said yes, so Matt's officially joined our team. He came out and hung out with us at our office. It was a lot of fun, and we continue to push the product forward. After we came on board, we're still executing on our dream. We have 125 people now. We're adding features and building the platform and getting bigger and bigger customers, and it's been a wild ride. So that is the acquisition story of Heroku.